HTML5.1 です。アップキャッシュとテンプレートと GitHub の話。This is my details. Email mike@w3.org, Twitter sideshow Barker, and also the HTML5 account on Twitter is my account. So please follow してください。タイムは40分で。
あ、そうです。
はい、じゃあ。今日の新しい言葉は declarative と imperative っていうの。それプログラミングラングエッジの関係あるね。declarative programming と imperative programming。日本語では宣言型と命令型のコントラスト。アップキャッシュ。みんなアップキャッシュご存知ですか？HTML5 のオフラインウェブアプリケーションっていうのためにそのインターフェースはアプリケーションキャッシュっていうのインターフェース。So this is for writing offline web applications, supposedly. So, でも今の状態はHTML5 のアップキャッシュ、オフラインウェブアプリケーションっていうスペックの中にだけど、キャッシュアプリケーション、本当にキャッシュアプリケーション、オフラインだけじゃない、オンラインでもアップキャッシュからファイルをサーブする。So even when you're offline, even when you're online, if your application has an application cache associated with it, the files in that cache get served from the cache, no matter what. You have to work hard to actually get the files from the network instead. 何かアップキャッシュ使ってる人は手を挙げてください。ないですね。ラッキーだよ。今のアップキャッシュはたくさん問題があるよ。やりにくい。って感じ。But the good news is we're working on a new application cache feature. これすごく新しい。今、秘密ぐらい。It's still kind of secret. And I thought this was going to be announced last week. でも、the guy who's working on it didn't finish last week. So 多分、今週。ぐらい。でも I'm going to show you today what it looks like because I'm tired of waiting. So, you're the first people to see this. ちょっと待って。これ、Navigation Controller っていうやつ。Probably can't read these comments. Let me make it bigger. So the idea of the navigation controller is you have an interface that's property of the navigator object, and what you do is you register a piece of code, essentially a JavaScript file. You register that as the controller for your application. And I'll show you some of the pieces that are in that controller. But what you can see here, it says, once you associate that controller with an origin, or actually a URL, well, you can see there's a wildcard there. What you can see is it says all top-level navigation requests for this site are going to be routed to this controller, routed to your code. And this is not standard code. It's custom code that you have to write. And then you can see once you have that controller registered, you can start doing some things with it. And the main way, well, really, the way that you communicate with the controller is using the HTML5 web messaging, post message, cross-document, cross-window messaging. So that's the simplest description of it. Let me show you some more details. So what you can see here further, is then that this is an example of using the controller to basically do the same thing that you would do with application cache. And you can see what you have is a cache object. This is part of the controller code. Now, this code, the idea of this code is this is going to be implemented in a web browser natively. This is not a separate JavaScript library, but the plan is to have a specification for this and have it get implemented in browsers. So what you can see is you're giving this cache object an object which is a list of files that you want to cache for this application. This is quite similar if you do application cache to what's called a manifest in application cache. You have some other methods that are getting called on this, but you can see this is the basic idea of how you would specify what you want to cache. Something else I wanted to show here. Another piece that's important is the guy who's writing this proposal is also working on something called DOM futures, and you can see this. The idea of futures is a programming. It's a new way of handling asynchronous programming. You know, if you write a lot of JavaScript, well, if you write JavaScript at all and you're doing it asynchronously, you can end up with a really deeply nested callbacks. It looks ugly for one thing, but it can get pretty complicated to write. And the futures mechanism, in part, makes it much easier to write that kind of code with nested callbacks. But this is a piece that's also going to go probably into the DOM specification, DOM futures, or it was called DOM promises before. It's not a new idea, but it's going to be newly introduced in the DOM and in JavaScript. So there's some other details here, and like I said, right now you can see this is private. It's a GitHub repository, but you can't get to it. So let me show you some other information about this. Some more details. This file is called controller.js, but you can see it's almost entirely comments. It should be called .comment maybe. Some things that this mechanism is going to rely on: shared workers. Shared worker is an idea of you can have a worker that is used by several applications, several windows. That's important for this feature. The other thing that I talked about, this is not private. This is public still. DOM futures. And so the other thing, this came from, if you've ever done any WebKit hacking, the idea for this navigation controller, it was inspired by some internal code that's part of WebKit, navigation controller code. And another thing that you'll notice about this code is that it uses JavaScript 6 classes. It's class structured code. So let's take a little bit more of a look at this before we move on. You can see this word, declaratively. Controllers are installed declaratively against a globbing URL. Shared workers happens through message passing with web messaging. Let's look at a little more details here. Come in there. Better turn that off. There we go. Dispatch for all resources. Only bits of system have access to groups. Yeah, so this is the part I showed you. What it's returning, you can see this is the same mechanism for registering this application controller, and then that's returning a future object. Same thing with this ready method. Then we get into these classes. If you haven't done much JavaScript, this probably doesn't look strange to you, but to somebody who writes JavaScript, to see the word class in JavaScript it's a new thing. Here's the cache object. So you can see you've got basically an array of URLs that goes in, and so it goes into a map. And you have these other methods that you would expect to have on a cache object. Caching. So that's it for now. Here's another example of some code using it to write an app cache implementation that reads through a manifest file. So this would work with an existing manifest file if you have one. This code doesn't actually work, but it's a demonstration of how you would do it. So you create a new cache, you go and you read this cache manifest file, which is a simple text file. And this part you can see what it's doing. It's parsing it, and then you're adding those to the cache by reading from that manifest file. So the idea behind this is that none of the actual caching is handled automatically by the browser. 自動的じゃない。You have to write your custom code to interact with the cache. So what you could say about this, it's relatively low level API instead of high level. Application cache, existing application cache, is very high level API, and it's very limited. It's very simple, but it's also very limited. So the idea of this is it's a much lower level, but it's much more powerful. But cost of that is you have to write a lot of custom code in order to use it. But you will be using this year. I think this is going to get spec'd out and implemented pretty quickly. 多分ね、6ヶ月間かな。And here's something you can see. This is also just an example because this is not even stated in the other document. But this is a way that you could declaratively associate a controller with an application. So you just got this controller attribute, and then a path that shows, what it's for. This just says everything. Everything that's part of this site now will get handled by this controller. So what you can think of it as, you have your code here, you got the internet here, and normally what your code is doing is it's going out and making network requests. So the browser has a network stack, and normally without application cache, what you're doing is everything's going to the network stack. With application cache, how can I describe it? So currently with application cache, instead of going from your code to the network, what it does is it goes straight to the application cache, and it never goes to the network. It has no fall through, I guess you could say. But with the controller, all of your network requests for URLs go to that controller. Now the controller, the simplest case of a controller, that controller could just pass everything through. It doesn't have to do any caching at all. So what the controller does is any requests that you're not telling it to handle, they just fall through and they go out to the network. And that's the way it works. So it's basically a kind of proxy, I guess you could say, a internal application proxy, network proxy. By the way, this is not going to be called navigation controller. It's going to be called something controller. I haven't decided yet. It might be called application controller. It might be called something else. I can't remember what the other proposed names are, but maybe application controller. Okay, so that's what I have to say about application controller for now. Did I turn this on? And I'll take questions about this afterwards, but actually I'm not that familiar with it. I've pretty much told you all I know, and probably a lot of what I said is not 100% accurate. So, okay. For my slides. There we go. So we are going to fix application cache. 今のスペックの中にの existing app cache はちょっとデザインミスです。たまにそんな問題あるね。Local storage もね。Local storage has problems too. So this design is the product of about a year's worth of discussion. 3 meetings. There was the latest meeting was on February 8th, and that's where this was announced. The people who've been working on this are from Google, Mozilla, Twitter, Facebook, and Robin Bergeon from W3C also. And that's navigation controller. Application controller to NC. Mozilla also has a proposal which could go along with this controller proposal. That's public, actually, and that's included in my slides. So I'll post these slides later, and you can look at the Mozilla idea too. The other thing about application cache is that because it's much more flexible, navigation controller, because it's much more flexible, there's lots of other things that you could use this for. There's lots of other kinds of problems you could solve, not just offline. For example, 皆さんresponsive images ご存知ですか？その phrase. The idea of the responsive images is if you have a Retina, a Macintosh Retina, and you have a mobile, well, you're trying to deliver your web application to different kinds of screens, different kinds of devices. Retina, of course, has a really high density display, very, professional quality image you can see. Your normal laptop has a less powerful display, and then of course, the display on your smartphone is smaller, and the aspect ratio is different. You usually on your smartphone are looking at your pages in portrait. So the idea with responsive images is you can specify on the client side in your code a set of different images of different sizes or different cropping, and you're specifying this in your code, client side application. You're in your HTML. And the idea then is that the browser decides which of those images to display on which kind of device. Because the browser knows what kind of device it's running on. It has some information about the system that it's running on. And so the browser is in the best position to make a decision about which image to show on a certain device. The idea of this is client-side dake. You don't have to do anything on the server side. So you don't have to write stuff in PHP or Java or anything else. You do it all in your client-side code. Well, this navigation controller mechanism can also be used to implement a responsive images solution totally on the client side. So there's other things that this can be used for. Like I said, this is still just an idea, but I think it's going to be successful. Yeah, I really think that if this comes through, this is going to be #1 feature for this year. This is the most important new feature to come along in a long time. The idea a lot of people are proposing nowadays is offline first. And writing your applications in a way that allows them to work offline is a very smart way to just do application design. A lot of people are realizing this. So I think this year, you're going, if you aren't already, you're going to start writing a lot of offline-enabled application code. It'll become more common, and this will make it easier to do that. Ja. 次 template. これも今プロポーザルでもスペックあるよ。HTML templates というスペック。We just published the first public working draft of this. So this is a new element. It's part of something called web components. This is also the biggest, newest, important feature that's come along in a long time. これすごくすごくいい大事な。Actually, there's 4 other new elements that are proposed as part of this, but I don't have time to explain those today, and also it's pretty complicated. So I don't want to overwhelm you. Minutes. Yeah, and along with those actual elements, Web Components provides a way for you to create custom elements. And these are not just play elements. The difference between, well, you can create custom elements now. You can just make an element and use it in your code. But the idea of this custom elements is, the whole idea of Web Components is, you create an element and you can bind some behavior to it. That's the original idea of this. And when I say bind the behavior, you can, for example, you get down deep into the internals of the, you can have access deep into the internals of the browser element code. So you can create the simplest case is you can create a new element that behaves exactly like an existing element. For example, a form control. You can create something new, call it whatever you want, but you can bind it to the existing behavior of an input button or a date control or something. The idea with templates is this, though. So if you've done server-side programming, which I'm sure you have, you've probably done some templating. But basically what you do is you declare a document fragment. And when you declare that, the browser does almost nothing with it. So you put that document fragment into your document. But when the browser loads a page, it doesn't do anything with that document fragment. Well, it does one thing. It parses it. So it parses it into the DOM. It doesn't parse it into the same area of the DOM as the rest of your page is loaded into, but it is parsed and made available in the DOM to your script. And so what happens is that document fragment is in there, and you can do something with it in your script. You can use it, and you can reuse it. So that's the idea of why it's called template. You have this template object, essentially, that gets instantiated in the DOM, and it has properties associated with it. You can add properties. You can change properties. So you're basically, essentially, this is kind of like the same way in JavaScript that you have objects, custom objects that you can create, except you're declaratively declaring this template in HTML. So it makes it easier. You can write that template just the same way you would write your normal HTML page. So let me show you an example. This way. So this is a very simple example of a template. And you can see, really simple. It's just called template. You have an ID. You put some markup inside of it, and then you do something with it in your JavaScript code. So you can see query selector. It's just selecting this template, and well, it's just got a comment about what it's doing. Okay, so what it's saying here is then what you would do with the code. You can see in your template, you don't have any value on this source attribute. What you would do in your JavaScript code is you would instantiate this template, you would add some image there, and then you would start to do other stuff with it. The other stuff is what's more complicated. But the basic idea is you just have that template, you manipulate it through JavaScript, and then eventually, of course, you do add it to the DOM of your document in a way that displays something. So that's the template idea. So yeah, it's similar to, if you're doing object-oriented programming, it's similar to an object that you do something with in JavaScript or something like that. So you can do templating with imperative programming, purely. You don't have to have the markup. You can just say, create element, and then insert that into the DOM. Insert that element as a child of some parent node. That's the way we already do it. And there's JavaScript libraries that make it easy for you to do that kind of stuff. The idea of this, again, is that it's a declarative way to do templating. So it makes it easier for you. Especially if you're not a hardcore, JavaScript programmer and you prefer to work in markup more, then this will be more familiar for you. And there's a link to the spec, the HTML template spec. And there are several parts to web components. This is just one part of several pieces. And web components is an extremely powerful mechanism. It's going to change the way you make web applications. I think, like I said, a couple things are going to happen this year. The trend is offline first. You're going to be making more applications that are able to work offline. And you're also going to be making applications that use this web components mechanism. And I think it's going to change the way we do programming as much as Ajax changed the way we do programming, as much as XHR. I think even it's probably going to change things as much as CSS changed. Most of you probably aren't old enough to remember before there was CSS, but I am. I'm old. And I remember it was very different. So, if you do anything today that I ask you, make sure you do this one thing. Read this specification, Intro to Web Components. It's actually not a specification. It's an introductory document. Somebody should translate this, right? So, must read. Almost out of time, I think. How much? Hi. Source set and picture. Okay, I'll just say briefly. So, these are two new proposals for HTML 5.1 for responsive images. They are basically competing with each other. One is for a new attribute, and one is for a new element. The one that's more likely to succeed, I think, is the source set attribute, because the browser implementers don't like picture very much. They don't like the picture proposal. It's complicated to implement, but it's also likely to cause bugs, and bugs that source set isn't going to cause. We had a proposal for a new element called intent, but it's dead. Web intents is dead. Buried. Shinjatta. There's some hope that this will, reincarnation. Web activities. Mozilla is working on something called web activities, which is similar but simpler. Unfortunately, the guys who worked on web intents in Chrome say that it's unlikely that they will implement web activities, because they said it has the same problems as web intents. They stopped the work on web intents because of problems. We have a new element called main. This was just added last month. It's not such a huge, new, big thing, but it's quite useful. It's basically a replacement for when you do this. Div ID equals main, the main content of your page. Not the header, not the footer, the main part. That's all it is. However, it's very good for accessibility. People who use screen readers, or what we call accessibility technology, AT, it's very helpful for them to have the main part of the page explicitly identified. Because what they can do in their screen reader is they can jump past all the ads, past all the junk, and get to the main content. Yeah, it's already in Chrome. It's already in Firefox, the dev builds. In the case of Firefox, I think this is going to go into Firefox 21 or after 22. In Chrome, this will be out pretty soon. The next Chrome release, this will be in there. But it's already in Chrome beta. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is getting involved in W3C stuff. So we now have a W3C organizational area at GitHub. And the reason it's there is we want to make it possible for you to contribute to the work that we're doing. So we have two repos, HTML Test Suite and the HTML repo. This is what we hope that people are going to do with the test suite. You go to the homepage for that test suite, and you press a button on GitHub, and you fork the entire test suite. You make a copy of it, and you add that to your GitHub account. You go in there and you write some tests, and you send a pull request, and somebody reviews that pull request, and then your test gets added to the test suite. We've already got people doing this. So the best thing I suggest to do this is when you go in and look at a set of tests, take an existing test that does something that you're interested in, make a copy of it, have it do something slightly different, and then add that as a new test. And we've got a new test. So the thing about HTML spec is we need thousands and thousands of tests. 今ね、1万ぐらいテストケース。でも10万、20万ぐらい必要。だから手伝ってください。And we have the same thing for the spec. So you can actually work the entire HTML spec, contribute some text for something. The HTML working group reviewers editors will review that and then can get added to the spec. So we're using this open source model for spec development also. And I'll just show you really quick the GitHub page. Well, I'm not logged in, so let me go over here where I am logged in to show you. How many people have GitHub account? Okay, that's a lot. Well, everybody should have a GitHub account. It's free. But anyway, you can see there's a button here. This is the test suite. And you push this button, and an entire copy of the test suite will be created in your account. And then you can do whatever you want with that. And you just use Git, in your on your machine. And then you push the change back to your fork, and then you can send a pull request. So how many we have now? Yeah, we got about 6 open pull requests right now. You can see. じゃあ以上です。